Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the world. We are doing the Enlightenment podcast. We created it because we felt, of course, there's a lot to talk about that's going on in the world in general. But at this moment in time, we felt that it was really important to have dialogue about Palestine, to build awareness, to reach as many people as possible. And today, with my wife, a bona fide Palestinian, Hanan Katan, we will be covering the topic of Zionism. Often misunderstood, often found very confusing, and often conflated with Judaism. Zionism is quite a different thing. So let's jump right in. Hanan, I think of Zionism as a political movement that's separate from Judaism as a religion, but maybe as an ideology that uses the religion to further its requirements and its ends. Is that correct?
Yes, I think you are correct in saying it. Really, Jewish Zionism, I should say, well, Christian Zionism too, but Jewish Zionism came out of Central and Eastern Europe, and it was driven by European Jews wanting to establish a Jewish state by colonizing a land outside of Europe, basically.
Yeah. So that idea of European Jews wanting to have a Jewish state, for a lot of people, is associated with the Holocaust and after World War II.
Yeah, not really, because long before, way before the Holocaust, Theodore Herzl, who founded the movement in the late 19th century, so it's around 1897, the first Zionist Congress took place. And they started encouraging the immigration of a large number of European Jews to colonize Palestine in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So it was a very deliberate movement towards colonizing.
Okay, and starting like way before even World War One. Can you take us back a bit more? There was a reason that Zionism took hold initially. Um, I mean, Jews in Europe back then and long before were just being discriminated against badly by Christian Europeans, often, and anti-Semitism was definitely on the rise. So what was the problem with Zionism?
Yeah, it was a settler colonialist project, really, and it used the Jewish religion to claim the rights to Palestine, and it created a sort of religious fervor to encourage Jewish people and to brainwash people to immigrate to Palestine because they needed to a linchpin, if you like, to create that movement. And really, that was done while replacing the indigenous Palestinian people from their land. So, but really, to fully understand that, we need to go a little bit more back in time, if you like.
Okay, let's do it. Let's go back and can we start with something that was always confusing to me? I've learned about it now. Start with the three major divisions of Jewish people as they identify.
Yeah, you have the Ashkenazi European Jews, and then there's something called the Mizrahi Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. And then you have the Sephardic Jews who are mainly from Spain and Portugal. So the Sephardic Jews in the Iberian Spanish Peninsula really prospered for centuries under the Muslim reign of Al-Andalus in Spain. So yeah, so there are three different. There are also other smaller ones, but these are the main three ones that I know.
So that's going back in time. But that's really interesting that at that time the Jewish population was thriving under a Muslim rule of what is now Spain. But maybe it was Spain then, sorry, I'm not a historian, but anyway, back then, when the Christians then took over Spain and you had all these Catholic monarchs that we're familiar with from the history books, those monarchs of Spain and Portugal called for the expulsion of Jews and also Muslims. And many of them, both Jews and Muslims, ended up in Turkey and across the Middle East.
Yeah, exactly. And for 1,000 years, the Jews have been persecuted in Christian Europe and have fled to Muslim countries. So the Muslim world embraced them. They were citizens, they paid taxes, they prospered. And really, Arab Jews in Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, North Africa, all over across the Middle East, including Iran and Turkey, lived and did really well and were part of the civilization, including Arab Jews. So really, Islam respected the Jewish people as people of the book, as they did respect the Christians as well.
Okay. And actually, just many people in the West, again, something I was not very familiar with, don't realize that there are Jewish people today. Not that they lived in places like Iran, which is now considered, of course, a big enemy, but they lived in the Muslim world then, and they still do in places like Turkey and Iran.
Yes, exactly. In Iran, for example, there are 5 seats in parliament that are permanently held for minorities, religious minorities. So one for a Jewish member of parliament, 2 for Armenians, 1 for Zoroastrian, 1 for Assyrian. And there are roughly around 25 synagogues and Jewish schools in Iran. There are around 26 synagogues in Turkey and schools. So not many people, as you say, are aware of that. It's just something people disregard and not know about.
Yeah. Sorry, I took you off track. Let's go back to the Zionist project of the early 20th century. The Zionists had considered various countries to settle in. They looked at Uganda in East Africa, they looked at Canada, they looked at various countries quite seriously, but they settled on Palestine. Why?
A very good question. I wish they didn't. So the Zionist founders were secular. They were not religious at all. And they actually used religion to convince the Jewish people to buy into their ideology to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. So it made it easier for them to convince people using religion. And Palestine was not an empty land. It was a cradle of civilization and the hub between East and West and the birthplace of Christianity. So it was full of
Yeah.
indigenous Palestinian people.
Yeah, and exactly. Indigenous Palestinians who'd lived there for millennia. I mean, your DNA, as we mentioned in our first episode, is 99.9% from that region of Palestine.
Exactly. And these indigenous people included Christians, some Jewish people. In fact, around the end of the 19th century, there were around 24,000 Jewish people who lived in Palestine under the Ottoman rule. Also, another thing, the JNF, which is the Jewish National Fund, which is part of the Zionist project, was founded at around 1901, and they wanted to gain as much land of Palestine as possible for the Jewish community. So they raised a lot of money, and by 1948, when the Zionists took over a larger part of Palestine and by force, the Jewish people in Palestine owned around 5.8% of the land, so a very small percentage, despite their efforts to buy and raise money and to take over that way as much as possible.
Okay, well, 5.8%. So this is at the time of 1948, the Nakba, is a small percentage, but Jews, as you say, were a small minority of people in the region at that time. So be that as it may, what I understand is that the big problem here is that the Zionist agenda wasn't happy with 5.8%. It wasn't happy with 10, 20, 30, or 40%. That it wanted to take over all of Palestine. And this is quite a core principle when you research, the founding of Zionism and the people who are behind it and what they have written about, talked about, and is in the archives. So this was a core principle, whether it's Theodore Herzl or David Ben-Gurion. They spelled out very clearly that they wanted to have this entire region and that it would involve removing the indigenous Palestinian from the land. I was struck that both of them, amongst others, made that a very clear edict of Zionism, that they would have to remove the native population, the indigenous population, from the land forcibly. So with that in mind, where do the English come in? Because we keep hearing about the English and the Balfour Declaration in particular. Can you just give us a few lines on that?
Yeah, exactly. In the English. So in 1917, the Balfour Declaration promised the establishment of a Jewish national home in Ottoman-controlled Palestine.
Why was that? Why would the British do that?
Well, there are many reasons, but one of them was that the English wanted to have the support of the Jewish community during Britain's First World War efforts. So that was one reason.
And I'll tell you, because I know a little bit, that England might have had other motives. They did, and one of them, which is interesting, is that they wanted to restrict the wave of immigration into Britain of Jews who are fleeing the Russian Empire and Eastern Europe and who are fleeing anti-Semitism in those places. They didn't necessarily want them in Britain or in England. So an interesting bit of news there.
Yes, not racist at all. So So England actively encouraged European Jews to immigrate to Palestine. And many Jews then and even now, including the ultra Orthodox Jews, were and still are against Zionism, as they felt it encouraged anti-Semitism and they were not supportive of Jews settling in Palestine.
Yeah, encouraged anti-Semitism for the reasons we said. There's just a way to get. It was done to actually get rid of a Jewish population that was not necessarily wanted. And also, I think there are strange elements of the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community who see Zionism and Judaism very clearly as two separate things, which they are.
Yeah, exactly. And it suited the English to set up a European colonial power in the middle of the Middle East to stabilize the power in the region while knowing fully what the repercussions would be. So even though there was that kind of schism, what do you call it?
Schism. Yeah.
Schism, thank you, between sort of Judaism and they were a small minority, the Zionists. The English just continued with their plans, basically.
A political play. So you mentioned this very briefly at the top, and I was like, don't go there. Christian Zionism. Okay, it's another type of Zionism, which has its roots in 17th century English Puritanism. And the focus of Christian Zionism, if I understand it more or less, is that there is a second coming of Jesus, and that they feel this will be helped by having a Jewish homeland. We'll get into that in a second. But the British, the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, was a Christian Zionist, and he took great pride in his role in the Balfour Declaration. And he was a great supporter and maker of promises to the English Zionist Federation. So, do Christian Zionists, obviously Christians, and Jewish Zionists, obviously Jews, share the same agenda?
Well, yes and no, because Christian Zionists wanted the Jewish people in Palestine for their own end goal, if you like, which is that Jewish people should reject Judaism and adopt Christianity when the end of time comes. And they wanted to evangelize the Jews to fulfill their biblical end of days prophecy. So it was important for them to have Jewish people move to Palestine and take over for their end goal. For me, it's very anti-Semitic as well, if you ask me.
Yeah.
While Jewish Zionists had also their own, so they had similar goals, but for different reasons, let's say.
Yeah. So really the Zionists were looking for the Jews to convert to Christianity for the end of days to happen. But I guess that served a purpose for the Jewish Zionists, who are, I think, are hoping that the end of days is not that imminent. But Zionism of whatever kind was focused on removing Palestine as a concept, its nation, and to expel its people to make way for a Jewish state.
Yeah, and everyone keeps hearing about a land without a people for a people without a land. And this became a Jewish Zionist slogan. But actually, very few people know that originally it used to be used by Christian clergymen. And of course, we know it's a total lie. So, so we can talk about the sort of the surprising role of Christianity in Palestine, the evangelical Christianity, if you like, in the Palestinian issue, for example, the Scofield Bible, but we can discuss that in another episode. Our very dear friend and brilliant artist, Sandra Watfa, Palestinian artist, told us about it, and we were surprised we didn't know about it, but we can explore it in another episode as well.
Yeah, maybe we'll get Sandra on the show to do that. I think that'll be great. But this term of a land without a people, which is still taught to young American Jews today, is a good example of the use of Hasbara, which is the Zionist propaganda that started way back in like 1912 or somewhere around there, when clearly Palestinians have been living on the land for centuries. And to me, it's just brutally, it's racist. It's these Palestinians were not even looked at as being important enough, even though there were a lot of them. It's a very colonialist view, and it reminds me very deeply of South Africa, where my parents, certainly not on the same scale, but experienced very similar feeling of being other than or not important because they had a darker skin color. So all of that, it feels so old school now when we live in a supposedly progressive times in 2024. Do you think there is a shift happening in people's perceptions in the world?
Yes, I do. But just to acknowledge that your parents also went through apartheid and had to leave South Africa. But just to answer your question, I think people are finally opening up to the fact that Israel is a settler colonial project, and it continues to oppress and dispossess Palestinians from their land. And there's more awareness, if you like, that the Palestinians continue to struggle and have struggled since sort of for their freedom and equal rights for over 76 years. But we can do another episode on that. But thankfully, I think we're seeing an increasing number of young and old brave American Jews, people who are realizing that Zionism is an ethno-supremacist ideology. And they are now extremely active in demonstrations, at university encampments, being vocal with their local representatives, and also saying it's not happening in my name and never again means for everyone.
Yeah, I agree. We're seeing that shift, and it's one of the few things that gives us hope in a time when we're seeing horrific images through social media primarily, because one of my bugbears is that the CNNs, the BBCs of the world do not cover these issues in anything like a balanced way. But people are starting to learn about what truly happened and what's been happening for the past 76 years. And what is different now, I think, that with the genocide that's taking place in Gaza, more and more people are speaking out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm very grateful. I hope more people do. But sadly, the PR machine is in full force, claiming that being pro-Palestinian is being anti-Semitic. And they're trying to silence these voices who are advocating for Palestinian human rights.
Yeah. But on a hopeful note, these movements for justice and accountability are definitely growing, especially amongst younger people who are not used to getting their news and their state, imagery and stuff from the same old places, and newer voices are getting heard, which is great.
Yeah, and thankfully they want to sort of stop the continuous ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, who are the indigenous people, and to stop cleansing them from their homes, their livelihoods, their land, their history, and so on. So that's really a positive, I have to say.
Yeah, absolutely, and their lives. And not a moment too soon, because every day we're seeing in the West Bank Palestinians being thrown out of their home, their lands being burned and being taken over. What's next for us? We're going to discuss next the Palestinian revolt, when the Palestinians rejected the presence of the English occupying army on their soil. That takes us into the late 1930s. We're trying to sort of vaguely move in some sort of historical order for you. If you have any particular questions or topics for us to cover, just let us know. Drop a little note on our messages or on our comment section. And if you enjoyed this talk, please do subscribe and also share with your friends and family. Our aim for doing this podcast is to reach as many people as possible, of course, and to try to bring our viewpoint, which we hope to be humanist, and to bring some clarity to the situation, with the proviso that neither of us are historians.
That's for sure. But we also believe that stories matter and representation matters. So it's important for us to continue to do that. And thank you for taking the time, as Shamim said, to watch. Please subscribe and hopefully see you again very soon. Take care.